thank you so much for getting up early and coming to this session. And as we were just saying, we also are joined by Catherine Lanois and Guillaume Mazot, and they apparently are at the Sorbonne, the troisième étage. And Julia Douthwaite will actually introduce them at the next session. But right now, I'm Lesley Walker, and it's my pleasure to introduce Ken Alder, who is Professor of History and the Milton H. Wilson Professor in the Humanities at Northwestern University, where he directs the Science and Culture program. His first book of history, Engineering the Revolution, Arms and the Enlightenment in France, 1997, won the 1998 Prize of the Society for the History of Technology. His second book, The Measure of All Things, The 7-Year Odyssey and Hidden Error That Transformed the World, 2002, which is a great story and a fabulous read about two Enlightenment astronomers, Delambre and Méchain, has been translated into 13 languages, won the Kagan Prize of the Historical Society, the Davis Prize of the History of Science Society, and the Dingle Prize of the British Society of the History of Science. Leaving the field of French history, Professor Alder has published The Lie Detectors, The History of an American Obsession, an examination of the failed efforts to transform American justice by means of scientific machinery. He is currently working on a project entitled The Forensic Self, A History of the Sciences of Personal Identification from the Renaissance to the Genome. For this project, he has won grants from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Science Foundation, and the American Philosophical Society. What you might not know about Professor Alder is that he was born and raised near Berkeley, California, where he was part of a busing program to achieve racial integration in the public schools, and that was the subject of his first novel, The White Bus. In 1987, and he says that he's actually working on a third novel, I believe. So today, the title of this talk today is History of Science as Means, Mediating the Materialist and Political Histories of the French Revolution.
Thank you for that introduction, and good morning, everybody, and bienvenue à Paris aussi, dans l'après-midi. But I'm going to speak to you today in pretty general terms about the history of science as a possible tool for thinking through some of the issues that have long plagued or perplexed French historians and historians of the French. I'm flattered to be asked by Mary and Julia to participate, and though my remarks are going to be fairly general today, I'm happy to use them as a prompt for our discussion. I mean, that's sort of what a roundtable should be for. That's how it was sort of presented, and we hope we have a good discussion afterwards. Well, there are about a gabillion ways one might characterize the historiography of the French Revolution, lo these last 2 decades, let alone 2 centuries. But one persistent fault line between the parties that today fly under the banner of materialist and discursive histories, or to simplify, under things and words. Under the former, we find social historians, including Marxists like Soboul, but also contrarians like Taine or Jacobin nationalists like Mathiez. Under the latter, we find many styles of political history, from the 19th-century liberals to Fourier and the revisionists. But I know you're already protesting that my division is absurdly neat. Marxists like Vauvel illuminated mentalité, and revisionists like Ozouf pioneered material culture. And no wonder. It's hard to imagine a history of the French Revolution that didn't wrestle with transformations that were both socialist on one hand and discursive political on another. That's what makes the French Revolution a revolution. Still, our historiographical divide persists, as much a dispute about what needs explaining as what kinds of explanations count. So if you want my conclusion in advance, or as we say to our undergraduate's thesis first, I say that we should not only pitch into words and things, we should show how the people of the past, the revolutionaries included, link the two. And here is where the history of science, I think, can help. Because the field is obliged to confront that linkage at every turn. Now, okay, I said I'd be brief, thesis first, but now let me go on. Let me begin again, indeed. If we've learned one thing about the French Revolution in the 25 years since the revisionists overturned the Marxist Jacobin historiography, it's that the French Revolution was one thing, but has often been a passionate and bitter debate about what one thing the French Revolution should be. The same holds for science. If we've learned one thing from our revisionists, lo these 25 years, it's that science too is no one thing, but a tenuous unity of diverse sorts of knowledge claims and practices across time. Formerly, science was said to have its origins in its own revolution, a time when, in the 17th century, innovators wrought fundamental transformations in how nature was conceived, who could speak for it, and by what means. It was Alexandre Poiret who first named this the scientific revolution in the 1930s. But as Dan Edelstein, who I don't know, but just seems to have showed up, which is great, has reminded us, the 18th century had already marked out its own esprit philosophique as qualifying itself based on a kind of story it told from the 17th century as the country to be éclairé. Yet revisionist historians of science, Stephen Chapin as a good example, have questioned the coherence and thoroughgoingness of this so-called scientific revolution. Not just because the transformation took a century or was itself punctuated by conceptual shifts, for example, from Descartes to Newton, but because even when complete, the new natural philosophy can only say to be partially resembling our own science as we understand it today. For Simon, Schaffer, and Chapin, for example, the so-called scientific revolution just gave institutional form to a set of social technologies by which gentlemanly natural philosophers could articulate, in words, limited but durable claims about natural facts produced by esoteric machinery like air pumps, things. Tightly linked to this effort to reproduce technological acts in staged settings were new cultural practices that proved to be models for the kingdom as a whole, or as they put it in Leviathan and the Air Pump, solutions to the problem of knowledge, also solutions to the problem of the social order. But while this general proposition may still hold, the form of science that emerged in the early 19th century, our science, came to be organized around a different sense of what counted as a causal account of nature, new professional identities organized around disciplinary norms vetted by meritocratic practitioners, and laboratory practices and research norms that made planned technological innovation possible, ultimately resulting in a late 19th century second industrial revolution where science was finally applied to technology so as to engender the West's military-industrial cornucopia juggernaut. Well, to honor this latter process, some historians have identified a second scientific revolution beginning circa 1800. Mind you, the term is not caught on, even though it was Thomas Kuhn who proposed it. Though like the second industrial revolution, it may have been more decisive for the modern world than its more famous first. Still, this moment of inflection around 1800 is important, even if its characterization remains elusive, in part because these technological effects prove easier to stage in private laboratories or public entertainment than in capital-intensive industries like war-making, manufacturing, or the creating of some sorts of national infrastructure. Charles Gillespie, for example, has given us an encyclopedic catalog of such changes, which he then derides as encyclopedic, which doesn't really help very much. So the question is, what connection does this transformation around 1800 have with the French Revolution? So many revolutions and so little consensus. A political revolution or not? An industrial revolution or not? A scientific revolution or not? Is it just that historians need work and we have our own version of grantsmanship? Not quite. The problem is there is much at stake in these grand narratives of politics, techniques, and science, yet our primary injunction as historians is to not let them lock us into teleological accounts. For science, this problem is particularly acute because science's preeminent role in the West's self-understanding and its global material and political dominance have made its history a site for contentious debates about such sibilates as progress and objectivity. Indeed, the history of science has often served as a kind of intensifier for the epistemological quarrels that have exercised scholars in the humanities. How has the field responded? Here I should note that the history of science is an oddly unsettled discipline in that its practitioners are sometimes housed in their own specialty departments of the history of science, for example, at Harvard, or more often, or well, about equally often, lodged elsewhere, sometimes in history departments, such as I am, sometimes in interdisciplinary departments of science studies, such as the folks who work in this building, occasionally in science departments, sometimes in medical schools. In short, we really didn't professionalize very well. We're heterogeneously mishmashed, and Paris is even more confusing. We can get to that in a sec. I actually think this has been totally to our advantage. This has made the field a much, much more interesting field. It's made us more intellectually supple. There'll be problems, don't worry, this is not all boasting, but it kept us intellectually supple and perennially self-reflexive. And here's my thesis. It means that the orthogonal tugs have made the history of science into a means rather than an end. In practice, the field has done over the past years is fashion a set of tools to connect the so-called content of science with its content, preparation called the internal external features of a science. Now, some scholars think it passe to belabor such distinctions. We're all amphibians now, the story goes, and should congratulate ourselves on having put such tedious distinctions to rest. But so long as the field's central problem remains the tension between science's proliferating pluralities and its tenuous unity across disciplines, cultures, and time, then historians need some way to connect content with context, knowledge with form, objectivity with experience, facts with values, and so on. And to do this, the geography of the past 20 years developed tools that emphasize being passive, not actual change. Since the 1980s, the history of science has largely divorced itself from intellectual history and wed itself instead to an logically infected history of practice, which certainly includes one already is that historians rediscovered the distinctive early modern effort to marry theory and practice and the obligation on elite savants to explain the material effects that formerly been the province of artisans, apothecaries, projectors. But for the past 25 years, while historical cousins, revisionist historians of the French Revolution prominently focused on discursive meaning-making, historians have still felt obliged to show how meaning-making answered to thing. First may hold as well. So it's true that there's a coming of, let's say, retreat, which Gary Wilder has warned is imminent. When historians revert to social history, that is a kind of harsh way to put it, but revert to social history and domesticate the challenges posed by the cultural turn, the attention that historians of science pay to knowledge-making and meaning-making may yet make the field a valuable repository of critical reflection. And I will comment briefly on the very excellent Enlightenment panel that I heard yesterday, but it seemed that I really enjoyed all papers very much. It seemed there was a kind of there was intellectual history to confront practice. There was a social history that didn't actually make the case for mentalité, and there was a paper that tried to do both but was in too early a form to actually connect the two. And I was left somewhat dissatisfied, I'll be honest, and maybe, and I know some of you were there, not all of you were there. I was thinking how if science would be obliged to practice and the way that ideas are instantiated and made to do work. And in that sense, I was wondering whether a certain form of history of science, not a history of science that studies optics, or even a history of technology that builds lamps, but the way those two are made to work together in the sorts of forms of practices, or the sorts of forms where that kind of work is instantiated, could be a helpful strategy. Maybe I'm getting a little ahead of myself, because this strategy of the history of science, this both and tool-making strategy, should make, I believe, the field a helpful resource for historians bedeviled by the contradictions between practice, action, ideology, and social conditions, structures, and eventfulness, then, in short, between words and things. Of course, this puts the burden on us, historians of science, to show that their historical analysis does not stop at science's edge, and that they can treat scientific subjects no differently than treat non-scientific. Hence, this talk is written against the claim of scientific exceptionalism, in the same spirit that historians of America have criticized the moral grants in American exceptionalism, or Jim Snyder has written against Holland's exceptionalism. After all, and methodologically, the history of any subject, whether the 18th century laws of astronomy or the 18th century laws of illegitimacy, requires immersion in the technical particularities of time, place, and topic, attention to differences and similarities in knowledge-making among actors and historians, caution in reading distinct forms of evidence, guarded skepticism, gap between the condition beliefs. Of course, many different ways one might use the history of science to pry open historical propositions, including, the issues in and around the French Revolution, and my fellow panelists will speak to their methods. My own work is focused on technology and the troubling question, which was posed by Langdon Winter, as to whether artifacts have politics. I thought that the very revisionist historians created material culture, the Douthwaite, so often shied away from the functions these objects performed, as if what these objects were trying to do was too crass and obvious to be worthy of attention. The function of things is not crass and not obvious. It is as strange and serious as their symbolic potency. Even the word function a term we blithely associate with services rendered, has etymological roots which suggest performance. A usage we still hear in such phrases as the performance of an office or a high-purpose vehicle. Some effects may be designed as intended, but in either case, just how it come about that that thing performed like that. So my first project, Engineering the Revolution, was an attempt to read that era's social, economic, and political transformations through something like the total history of a material object. For such a project, of course, not just any object would do, certainly not a tote. Not that there's anything wrong with totes. So I picked the gun, because it was not only freighted with symbolic meanings, but because its design, manufacture, and deployment was also of intense concern to the old regime, which had in fact cultivated a new cadre of expert engineers to bring it under rational control. These engineers pioneered new forms of knowledge-making, which were this Galilean first physics. It's a new form of engineering rationality. New forms of manufacturing, such as interchangeable part manufacturing, that redefined the relationship between the state, artisans, and private capital. And new forms of warfare that launched the mobile battle systems that powered many of the revolutions. But in a way, all these projects never really reached fruition. What turned out to be most important was that these engineers in the process turned these same evaluative techniques that they had used on things, on themselves, creating a new form of technocratic meritocracy. They turned themselves into objects for evaluation. And that became the structuring principle of the revolutionary state, meritocratic order, engineering being one of the obvious places to look for. Similarly, in my second book, The Measure of All Things, on the origins of the metric system revolution, one of the most banal features of daily life. Of course, measurement was an intense concern to the state as well as to the millions of ordinary citizens who carried out quotidian economic trends and who pleaded for metrical reform in thousands. And wow, disappointed at the result. Again, my goal is that the metric system's symbolic political features were to its socialists. I've also created this metrical language, saw it as a tool of political equality, as well as in a goal for articulating. They also saw an intent on breaking down autarks and customer practice. First in the process of knowledge that invented the very supposedly meter and unit. In projects, this was not a mean range of words and mean actions. Consequently, meant for other scholars who lead through Scientology, Politico revolution. For scholars of total and Scientology, turned out distinct the direct economy. The 18th self-beat fashion was that on defined first lights and then abroad. Consumption of tea became its toxic word for as the explosions and pamphlets have shown. Scholars of national committees became clones of the colony. His Joe Lesley looked at how advertising did new among those temperature history of the pollution marketplace. And here, Emma has shown how the disc of liquor, food, sin, assessed by palate, by cracks, passive transforms. Similar in their recent different presidents, Bill and much analysis, critically introduced the process of chasm, history of the pollution. Various scholars have shown scientific machine culture and science. Really makes to the book machine. The French Revolution so much and the Collective Revolution. It does it in its things and work only be romantic images that are patronized and instrument-mediated, including and physical effects. And sensitive, magnetic wires, improved type, Humboldt's had network, urologic ages, higher beer, fine opera, the ruse for mass gain, and locomotively love. Links, because most tend to exuberant, vital to vitality, revolution, box, 18, and their collapse. Third, focusing on shift between an act or sentence. How the more client sciences for and perversion. Erskine's work is the sense of origins of imperial scientism in century and does mask for revolution, which is its vital ultimate with the evolutionary symbol, with the Philippos's abstract. Or scholars to break the hexagon, test the functions in and universe and to well sciences works. What happens in the public of the revolution? Provided set square their mistake with the science of war. My student who answers this question or coming book from Chicago, attentive to the middle links that England and France and the German. In the movement of these scientific is out that they can respond to Harrison Lodge's less a sciences or entity than a time metropolitan imperial. Next domain, the substantial of the things, ideation in French. Look at titles, inspired the choir. Don't get me wrong, they find possible into the evidence can give these themes, or the faith, or the greater or speeches. They recognize the thing and makings. All that were historic in the funders are advocacy. Thing really long that are working full have to be as into say that do too. Thank you.
Maybe a couple of questions, and somebody has a or dying. I think that teams 1920 with the anesthetic condition. If somebody can just jump now, take a question, if you could speak. So.
Yeah, no, I think.
So next, Julia does. Speaker Julia Douthwaite, French, please down it's at the Mary the Frankenstein of 70 other raptors evolutionary place. There two little girl man monster experiments each of Mets, Hagas to two exotic women, prehistoric and culture strategies and relations 1890. Reporter Professor Dow has been the field of the Google Foundation, the National Humanities, and the Foundation. She also co-authored volumes of disciplinary published on ranging Treatment, Foyer, and World War. Into an 11 the organizer can do happy creative nationals with Notre Dame alongside Jean-Jacques, right, of from the entire art service of entities with dignity under you. She also has compared literary research in the U.S. and France for 18e siècle, and an article dealing with bienfaisance and some century philosophe called Chariots for Schmucks. I'm looking forward to hearing more today about her new concept that she calls the new positivism. The title of Professor Douthwaite's talk today is Putting the New Positive to Work on Politico-Literary History, the Case of the French Frankenstein.
Okay, bonjour Guillaume et Catherine. Tout à l'heure. Bon, positivism gets a bad rap these days, at least in literary circles. One of the most targeted attacks can be found in the masthead of a book series called Flashpoints, which was founded and edited by a group of English professors in the California system and published by the UC Press. The mission statement declares, the series solicits books that consider literature beyond strictly national and disciplinary frameworks, distinguished by their historical grounding and their theoretical and conceptual strength. We seek studies that engage theory without losing touch with history and work historically without falling into uncritical positivism. The opposition posited there between a theoretical and conceptual strength on the one hand and an uncritical positivism on the other hand should give us pause. It is erroneous to assume that positivism was ever unconnected from the world of ideas and politics. Indeed, Auguste Comte in the 1830s and 40s promoted positivism specifically to usher in what he hoped would be broad-ranging political platform intended to emancipate humankind. Whether that project succeeded is another question which I will not go into today. Nevertheless, I want to argue that some tools borrowed from positivism provide just what we need for a more rigorous literary history of the revolution today. First, I'll share a few ideas on what I'm calling this new positivism and how it evolved. Then I'll share some discoveries on the text. It's actually called Le Miroir des événements actuels, that I'm calling it the French Frankenstein of 1790, its role in the history of science and technology, and its literary impact. As the watershed event which divides modernity from what is variously known as the Enlightenment or early modern Europe, the French Revolution, 1789-94, is considered the turning point in occidental history, literature, and the arts. And yet its impact on the literary scene remains obscure. Until the 1990s, revolutionary studies, as you know, were the province of historians, into political, military, cultural, social, etc. In literary history, the revolution interested scholars of oratory or the press. More recently, some very good work has been done on history of the theater, notably by our host, Jeffrey Ravel, in his 1999 book, The Contested Parterre, and others that it has been cited since then. But students of French prose and poetry have stayed away. Our formation taught us that literature took a long hiatus, from Laclos' Liaison Dangereuse in 1782 to Chateaubriand's René in 1802. Aside from the marginal malevolent productions of Sade, we were told that nothing significant was published in the 20 most turbulent years of French history. That started to change in the 1980s, as a new generation, inspired by the linguistic turn in historiography and supported by new reference tools and databases, started excavating this fascinating archive. Malcolm Cook's 1982 book-length study offered the first compact framework for revolutionary fiction organized by genre. Also notable was the inventory of women authors constructed by Carla Hess, and the capable overview of revolutionary genres written by Béatrice Didier, as well as many more titles. As is the case with any first wave, however, some of this scholarship elicited resistance or even hostility for what critics have perceived as inadequate methodology of historical contextualization, or the dubious literary qualities of the texts in question. Malcolm Cook's techniques of close textual analysis made perfect sense when applied to masterworks of geniuses like Bernardin de Saint-Pierre, author of Paul et Virginie, but the corpus of uneven quality covered in his 1982 study produced a catalog of themes that left unanswered the question of significance. In her now classic 1992 book, The Family Romance of the French Revolution, Lynn Hunt illuminated the tortured family relations in key texts of fiction by applying Freudian theory and political analysis to stunning effect. But she was roundly berated by Philip Stewart for misappropriating literature as historical evidence. Carla Hess made a case for women's publishing during the 1790s in The Other Enlightenment, 2001. But she failed to explain what those writers contributed to longer-term developments in literary history, according to Joan de Jean, who called her out on that. Some of these judgments are valid, some not so much. Revolutionary literature is devilishly difficult to understand. Methods have been long in coming. Perhaps the present intervention might help a little bit. So here are the two positivist truths that I take to be evident. Number one, that there are certain facts, political and biographical, one needs to know to make sense of texts during a revolution. And number two, literature of 1803 reveals in its the science of its own production. The reason for the first point is simple. Given the neglect suffered by these writers, their lives are largely unknown. And yet the personal is political. It does matter whether it was aligned with the Jacobs or the Girondins and when, what kind of audience they had for their work, and if they were imprisoned, when, under whose orders. Although he or she may disavow such material issues in their writing, this context nevertheless provides the horizon of expectations needed to approximate, at a distance of 2 centuries, what these authors were trying to say and who they were trying to reach. Although none of us is perfect, and least of all myself, one has to admit that lack of biographical knowledge and physical context has led to some misunderstanding about the meaning of texts. Consider, for example, the 2005 edition of Jean-Baptiste Piquenard's novel Adonis le Bon Nègre, Anecdote Coloniale, 1798, edited by Yumna Sharara. In the introduction, Sharara claimed that the author only visited Saint-Domingue once, in 1791, and that his colonial brotherhood was thus more inspired by literary history and the pastoral tradition than any real-life praxis. Well, Chris Bonji debunked Sharara's errors in his edition of Adonis, published the next year, and in his interesting book called Friends and Enemies, The Scribal Politics of Post-Colonial Literature. He provided crucial information of a very political nature about the author's work as a longtime resident in Saint-Domingue and a man closely tied to the Jacobins. This context informs his portrayal of the hero Adonis. I could cite similar cautionary tales from the other side of the disciplinary divide as well, of historians who have misread literary texts because they've neglected subtle clues regarding the work's genre. But given the present audience, I will not. My point is, along with biographical research, authors, and the material conditions of publishing, tightly hewn linguistic analysis is essential for interpreting texts whose forms themselves wielded meaning. The choice of a genre, or the choice to mix several genres, was a deliberate act aimed at generating what Pierre Bourdieu has taught us to consider as cultural capital. Cultural capital refers to the knowledge or ability that equips people at a given moment with the imagination or competence needed to decipher artifacts of the culture. The pseudo-realism of the secret history, or histoire secrète, with its dozens of legalistic pièces justificatives, for example, made different demands on the reader and promised a different kind of outcome than did Oriental tales couched in fairy tale conventions. Whether or not to employ neologisms such as liberticide or terroriste, and how more anodyne words such as le peuple and pitié were used, reveal other ways that authors molded every story's message to create particular effects at specific moments in time. The representation of things such as crowds, revolutionary leaders, and bloodshed is equally telling in that it endowed events with a causality that gave the revolution a sense of logic in fiction or not, as in the case of Flaubert. Such issues, icons, and language constitute the cultural capital that was second nature among literate audiences in the 1790s. Knowing how to interpret them is very difficult, but I think it's... In adopting this approach, one need not reduce literature to societal types that were embraced by the archetypal positivist Hippolyte Taine. But we should liberate ourselves, and this may be more of an Anglo-American issue than a French issue, and I'd be curious to talk to our colleagues in France to know what they think. But here in the United States, and I'm talking about literary history here, I believe we should liberate ourselves from the straitjacket of theory, whether it is postmodern, Lacanian, Foucauldian, or other, and take heed of Fustel de Coulanges and let the documents mold our conclusions. This method of qualitative and to a certain extent quantitative content analysis is not, I assure you, an approach for interpreting all literature. But a decade of study has convinced me, however, that the prerequisite to any literary history of the Revolution must be to establish at least one viable literal meaning for the texts in question. As Stanley Fish out, there will always be a literal meaning, but one, it will not always have one, and two, it can change. The potential parameters of that change in meaning, real or imagined, present or future, are among the things that I'd like us to pursue. The newness of this new positivism derives from its relevance for today's readers, too. The question, what are the literary musts of the French Revolution and why should anyone care, is one that I feel keenly. From my experience as a teacher, I know that one cannot take it for granted that students will understand the Revolution's contribution to the founding of modern democracies, let alone care about its role in literary history. Accordingly, I believe it is appropriate to highlight how the revolutionary heritage lived on afterwards, and even in our own world, in our vulnerable times today. As a glance at any newspaper will reveal, we still live in a world of propaganda, advertisement, political violence, terrorism, revolution, and reaction. So now, on to part two, the French Frankenstein. So what author wrote a parable about an inventor named Frankenstein and his life-size artificial man? If you answered Mary Shelley, you would be half right. Long before Mary Shelley published her Modern Prometheus in 1818, an author penned a tale that resembles Shelley's in more ways than one. Contrary to the assertions of such as Annie and Martin Serrin, who declared in 1996 that there exists no such thing, my research has uncovered a number of fictions about artificial creation from the 1790s, the most spectacular being the inventor named Frankenstein in François Félix Nogaret's novella Le miroir des événements réels ou La belle au plus offrant, Histoire à deux visages, 1790. This alignment of circumstances presents an intriguing coincidence. Indeed, it is simply astonishing the story about an inventor named Frankenstein who builds an artificial human during the French Revolution, especially since the Revolution and its attempt to make a new man and a new nation have long been a central lens for those English scholars viewing Shelley's work, and also for the very concept of social engineering. Nogaret's original story of kindly automatons conflates technology and politics manner befitting French political debates of the years late 1789, 90, early 91. The characters employ state-of-the-art tools in microscopy, astronomy, and aeronautics to tell a tale that elegantly supports scientific progress and industrial innovation in a state governed by talent, not tradition. The plot is set up as a contest in which 6 inventors compete to win a young woman's heart. This hero and nation allegory is a common enough motif in revolutionary materialism to know, and it was as such by Huguette Krief in a 2005 article, the only critical mention of the miroir to date. But the courtship plot is not just a comedic device. It also serves to advance technology in a sluggish economy. And the novella Nouveau is not only marriage, but also an arresting example of human-humanoid interaction, set in motion by inventors with significant names. Vac, Vic, Vaucanson, Frankenstein, a combination of the name of the great French engineer Vaucanson and the Teutonic-sounding name, and Nicator, Reed Necker, Louis XVI's finance minister. Explicitly labeled a phenomenon of animal economy, the 2 automatons during the contest debunk observers' belief in a divine hand, prove the triumph of science over superstition, and demonstrate the author's familiarity with the latest developments in automation. To explain the surprising prescience of Nogaret's tale, I'd like to remind you of some of the that gave rise to it. The agitations concerning trade guilds and inventors' rights of 1790-91. From the petition submitted to the National Assembly in August 1790 and the committee work and behind-the-scenes lobbying that were doubtless undertaken by its principals, one of whom was a highly visible ci-devant, with an extensive network at court and among the wealthy, emerged the new patent laws passed in January 1791. The in-depth newspaper reportage of this decree, which might seem like a technical matter, should alert us to the fact that it was thought a great impact on the French economy. So all accounts point to summer 1790 as a turning point in the state support of French genius. Under the Ancien Régime, inventors benefited from a basic patent system of brevet, whereby the Crown, through its institutional apparatus, authorized worthy artisans to profit from exclusive control over their discoveries for a certain time. But beginning in August 1790, the government was forced to reconsider defining this role and even to relinquish traditional controls in order to keep technical talent in France. A group of self-avowed artistes inventeurs, later called the Société des Inventions et Découvertes, took form in the euphoric days of summer 1790, when Paris was inundated with delegates from all the provinces who came to celebrate the July 14th Festival of the Federation. From the outpourings of fraternity they witnessed in the streets and the media, these men doubtless picked up a sense of urgency about their own status in an economy that was daily looking less familiar. They decided to push for a new system of brevet to protect their own and their nation's productivity. On September 6th, the petition was referred to the Comité d'Agriculture et de Commerce, which named Deputy Chevalier Stanislas de Boufflers to prepare a report on it for the Assembly. Boufflers presented the fruits of his labor to the Assembly on December 31st. It was a roaring success. The Chronique de Paris noted the next day that his report, the draft decree, and the speech were often applauded. The King's assent made the decree into law on January 7, 1791. An anxious awareness about the fragility of French industry was the founding assumption of Paris' request, Boufflers' report, and the new law. Citing the rights of man, the report argues that useful ideas and discoveries must belong to their originators, and predicts that woe will befall the state to protect individuals. In terms of Paris' Le Miroir, the Boufflers decree insinuates that failure to recognize this right may well have contributed to discouraging French industry, and to have expatriated from France a large number of inventions. France should have had the initial advantages. Proudhon's Révolution de Paris sought to staunch the flow by printing all 18 articles of this new law, more than 4 pages, in January 1790. The legislation facilitating patents and suppressing trade guilds, the expansion of mechanization constitutes the other fundamental event of the period, as Ken Alder notes in Engineering the Revolution. From the steam engines digging trenches for Paris sewers, to machines making interchangeable gun parts, and the mechanized looms that promised to weave cotton in record-breaking time, new technologies of automation contributed the most to the acceleration of the great political, social, and economic upheavals of the late century. But the most popular invention, I would contend, was the automaton. Although they were not much like the other mechanisms of their day, weaving looms or grinding mills, these machines were the most popularly featured in the newspapers, at least in these months and years that I was studying for this chapter, and most beloved by contemporary audiences. By 1790, the automaton shows were a familiar sight in London, Paris, and other capital cities, and in the provinces too. Similar to the shows hosted in London, Cox's Museum, or Paddock's Mechanic Theatre, were the automaton shows in Paris. All featured a lineage reaching back to the 1730s, alongside state-of-the-art inventions. Let us see how Nogaret reworked the automaton story in his revolutionary allegory. François Félix Nogaret, 1740 to 1801, was a highly recognized writer in the 1770s and a regular at the court. He circulated in the circles that the Chevalier de Boufflers and he was wont to as well, and wrote salacious verse, as Boufflers also. He worked as a librarian for the king's sister-in-law, the Comtesse d'Artois, and attracted the attention of scientists such as Buffon and Alençon, for his dabbling in natural history. No longer a young man in 1989, Milgar dismissed this frivolous style and brandished an engaged persona, claiming to wield his pen as others bear arms. Although he wrote many, many books during this period and right up until his 89th year, the year 1790 marks the release of his most elaborate political fiction, Le Miroir des événements actuels, which is about 80 pages long. And there are 3 copies of it in the world, and one at the BNF, one at the BHVP, and one at Versailles. The edition at Princeton was either stolen or lost in the last 5 years. Le Miroir is written in one of those hybrid genres that are so common under the Revolution. The author called it an erotico-political-patriotic historiette. It is basically an allegory set in ancient Syracuse and can be read on 4 levels of significance, 3 of which I will spare you. The 4th is what interests us. It is a comment on the current state of invention and technology and an appeal to French technicians to regenerate the national genius. Like the National Assembly, which launched a series of decrees to protect inventors in the course of 1790-91, Nogaret's heroine, a 17-year-old orphan named Aglionice, decides to try to spur all those geniuses to action. And to launch her plan, she asks a Roman senator, I have the quote here, at least I speak a little French for you, elle lui demande gaiement s'il ne verrait pas avec plaisir tous ces grands faiseurs de machines, depuis si longtemps dans l'inaction, prendre enfin l'essor et laisser à Syracuse quelques monuments de leur savoir. She offers her hand in marriage to who will make the most ingenious machine, and the contest begins. So 6 suitors present themselves, each symbolizing a trend in science and technology as inflected by controversies of the day. The first suitor offers a walking steel tripod, but the practical heroine refuses up front because, as the narrator notes, un trépied qui ne bronche pas en portant la marmite est préférable à un trépied qui est le point du feu. An allusion to Vulcan, the god of metallurgy and fast tripods, is patent. It will also be recalled that the Revolutionary period was heavily marked by tripartite imagery, as in the iconography of Masonic triangles, the 3 legs of the tripod being an analogy for the 3 estates. Like these legs, the assembly was not supposed to follow its own caprices, or but rather to stand firm in service of the nation. The second suitor arrives with luxury objects, a minuscule chariot and a tiny ship wrought from precious ivory. But when the heroine harnesses the chariot to a housefly, it disappears out the window. And when she floats the ship in a vase of water, it vanishes, leaving behind only a green film, a phenomenon that prompts a biology lesson on freshwater polyps. The third inventor is a magician with a long name ending in la, var, kochibas, a Baroque Greco-Hebrew designation signifying false prophet, speculator, and swindler, according to a footnote. He offers a telescope, but while she is looking for people on the moon, he vanishes, having stolen all her money and jewels. This alludes to the suspicion of charlatans, both in finance and science, that was prevalent at the time, and casts the vendor of optics in a shady light that prefigures the fiendish Coppola in E.T.A. Hoffman's tale, The Sandman. The 4th suitor bears a name that combines the surnames of famous to infamous officers in the Royal Army and the designation aristo. Counting on the avarice of the heroine, who is, after all, a poor commoner, he presents an enormous hot air balloon and invites her to climb in, join his conspiracy, and ascend the social hierarchy as his wife. She refuses, of course. It is the last 2 inventors who win. One marries Aglionice, and the other marries her sister. The first describes himself as a good Gaul, a free man, and gives his name, Vac Vic Vaucanson Frankenstein. He presents a life-size human, cast in bronze, who sits in a chair with a flute in each hand. Along with the 22 melodies that the flautist produces, the inventor offers his devotion, telling Aglionice, "You will see, mademoiselle, that there is not a man alive who does not worship you. Ask, and the metal itself will obey." Magic seems to be in the air. Well, as you can see, this interlude contains multiple elements of the Frankenstein. The inventor is described as a handsome man. His gifts are compared with those of Prometheus. The text says, "Un artiste dont l'Olympe pourrait être jaloux, comme on assure fut autrefois de Prométhée." His machine seems to transcend the existential boundary between animate and inanimate. Although the flautist startles and frightens observers at first sight, it creates intimacy with its music. Even the learned senator is thunderstruck at the view of an invention that replicates humanity, and he says, or the narrator says, Il n'avait jamais ouï dire que l'homme eût, pour ainsi dire, créé son semblable. Moreover, the flautist's harmony creates an emotionally charged atmosphere. The first song it plays of a poignant ballad of a heart ravaged by love fills the hero with such bliss that she faints. On a word from the master, the automaton switches to a livelier air and brings her back. Sympathy switches or passes electric from the automaton to the heroine. The adventurous passions to transfuse right into her breast. Vitalist philosophy meets mechanics. But it is the last singer named Nicator who wins. He brings an invention symbolizing abundance, a beautiful female automaton holding a cornucopia stuffed with precious jewels. A confederate lurking in the skirt of this doll suggests that Nicator may be something of a showman. The heroine is nevertheless dazzled by his wealth, and so she chooses him and proposes her sister, Mary Frankenstein. So what interests me is how Perret yokes the political impulse to science and manufacturing and makes mechanical devices tell a normative lesson on how technology could support the new nation. The unwieldy tripod designer is dismissed for his excessive ambition. The craft of the artisan in ivory is a short-sighted focus on luxury and artifice instead of utility. The duplicitous telescope operator sneaks off, warning us against leaving credence to charlatans. The hot air balloon operator floats above the heads of the heroine and her mentor to disappear far away, like counter-revolutionary sympathizers abroad. Both of the successful inventions are based on a human image and perform human functions. They play music, bring gifts, and offer to serve. Like Vaucanson's expertise in mechanization, which gained him a prominent post in manufacturing, their inventors' technical skills bode well for the nation's industry. The choice of the sixth suitor, fifth, reveals dramatic or stability. So the allegory of all five characters happy plans for a future where merit, not privilege, will rule. As much as I'm fascinated by the miroir, I cannot profess to have captured its reception just yet. As you probably know, writing the reception literature is very difficult. But the fact that Nogaret rewrote this tale more times in 1795 and 1800, removing the politics and highlighting the technology, is arresting. So in closing, let's see where the automaton tale leads us in later years. The two automaton tales by E.T.A. Hoffmann and Mary Shelley leave a greater psychological impact on the reader, partly because of the way they problematize the role of the automaton and the creator. Hoffmann portrays a conspiracy between two scientists, or technicians, who dupe a naive student with an automated doll in The Sandman, 1816. The inventor and his confederate, an instrument seller, together represent the most notorious traits of turn-of-the-century pseudoscience. The life-size doll Olympia, we learn, was the product of 20 years of Spallanzani's labor and includes the most modern facets of period invention, speech and movement, as well as one component among real-life inventors, I think, but maybe you could prove me wrong, and that would be realistic eyes. When they are knocked out of Olympia's head in the climactic scene of her destruction, and Daniel, the crazy in love with her, sees them snipe at him from the floor, the discrepancy between the eyeless dummy and his imagined beloved moves him to rage, insanity, and ultimately suicide. A suspicious attitude towards science and technology marks Shelley's work, too. Like a Pygmalion scenario gone terribly awry, Frankenstein's creature bears the mark of its inventor, that is, an adolescent vision of superhuman energy and ambition. In its single-minded pursuit to find a way of infusing life into an inanimate body, the scientist apparently forgot to think through the consequences, such as the body's potential to procreate. A frenetic striving toward ill-conceived and irresponsible goals is Victor's tragic character flaw, and it is incarnated in the creature that he creates. But it was not the creature's fault. Physically, he is an amalgam of random body parts, and mentally, he is a product of his creator's indifference and society's ill will. In Shelley's depiction of the hapless creature struggling to society and that he perceives to be aiming for his extinction, so isolationism is a very failed answer to social anomy, and all-out anarchy seems right around the corner. In this, the author reveals her debt to the post-Waterloo age, when monarchical control was reimposed throughout Europe, but spontaneous actions made violence a very real threat. By the last scene, when the characters face off amongst their Arctic ice floes, one realizes the ultimate instability of the main story, about science, about technology, or about politics. So to conclude, the coincidences of an action linking Nogaret's Le Miroir des événements actuels and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein point to an important and epiphenomenon in literary history. But the automaton plays a different role in these works. The docile machines of Nogaret have one function, to help their creators find a wife, and by extension, to aid in the establishment of a new, better society that would make invention a national priority, one presumes. The period of Hoffman's tale is equally artisanal and equally docile. She perishes in a battle between rival inventors. Shelley's lonely creature, on the contrary, has a mind, a biology, and a will of his own. And that makes all the difference in dooming the invention to failure. So I hope that this little lesson on the French Frankenstein, its historical origins and literary successors, has shown the utility of the new positivism for literary studies today. Although they have traditionally been divorced from history of science and technology, you have seen how Nogaret's Le Miroir was indebted to both fields. It is texts like these that inspired me and show the gains to be made in bringing the revolution's lost chapters back to light. Thank you for your time and interest.
So it's my pleasure to introduce our last speaker, Mary Ashburn Miller. Mary is an assistant professor of history and humanities at Reed College and the author of A Natural History of Revolution, Violence and Nature in the French Revolutionary Imagination. And that was Cornell 2011. To support her scholarship, she has received several fellowships and awards, including a Fulbright grant, 2005-06. She was named an ACLS Niti Fellow in 2000-2011, and recently won a Graves Award, which recognizes excellence in humanities teaching among faculty on the West Coast. Her current research is on the immigré of the Revolution and on their return and reintegration into 19th-century France. She is currently at work on an article about immigrés in the annexed territories of Belgium and the left bank of the Rhine. And she's working on another article about the narratives of immigration as presented in petitions written by the immigrés seeking to return to France. Professor Miller's talk today is entitled Reassessing the Rhetoric and Reality of Nature and the Politics of the French Revolution.
Bonjour Guillaume and Kathleen. And I want to offer a special thanks to Julia for getting the ball rolling on this panel as well as on our French counterpart. And I've been really pleased to hear a certain amount of connection between our three papers. Perhaps this talk should have been titled Words and What We Should Do With Them or something like that. In the year 8, the esteemed naturalist Bernard Germain provided some reassuring words for this very panel in a speech that he gave to conclude his course in natural history. What an aid for the historian of human societies, he proclaimed, who are unsure about the development, the length, or the succession of events, be the view of the sublime annals that nature herself has engraved on the summits of mountains, into the sea, and in the innards of the earth. For Laissez-Ped, we poor historians of events like the French Revolution, we who must debate constantly over origins, agents, and narratives, we might try looking to the annals of the earth for real answers. When everything else is confusing, we can at least look to science. Now, as someone who barely passed high school physics, I rarely find looking to science to be a source of relief, assistance, let alone clarity. But in the past 15 years, it seems to me that historians have, in fact, been taking Laissez-Ped's advice. We have been looking to science. We've been looking there not in lieu of examining human events, but as a way of learning more about human events, and particularly about the human events of the French Revolution. This panel was created in recognition of this recent interest in science and nature in our studies of the Revolution. An interest manifested in works not only by those of us on this panel, but also by scholars including Emma Sperry, Ben Edelstein, Peter McPhee, Rolf Reichart, Renaud Abad, Peter Hansen, Noel Plack, among others. I'm hoping we can today coin the term a natural turn in the studies of the French Revolution. I'll think about what that might consist of. Now, of course, Lacépède's trust in science came out of a very particular set of circumstances, not least of which was the extraordinary confusion into which philosophy and politics had been thrown over the course of the 10 years prior to his 1800 speech. When the human world seemed to make little sense, it is no surprise that Lacépède turned to the natural world as a source of consolation and even of faith. He also, of course, had a great self-interest in promoting the usefulness of the natural world as a historian at the Museum de l'Histoire, or as a, naturalist there. And yet we, too, seem to have a certain faith that learning more about scientific inquiry, environmental practices, and natural imagery during the French Revolution will help us understand that period of tumult. In my own case, my 2011 book, A Natural History of Revolution, examined rhetorical invocations of nature in public speech during the revolutionary period, particularly in plays, speech, festivals, and newspaper reports, in words. I argued that the ways in which revolutionaries drew analogies between the very human violence that they witnessed, or in some cases sanctioned or enacted, and the forces of sublime nature, things like lightning bolts or volcanic eruptions, could help us understand a few key things about the most radical phase of the revolution. First, revolutionaries often use natural imagery to provide a sense of order to what seemed to be disorder, and to make apparently destructive activity seem constructive of a new order. Nature, after all, had plenty of examples of events that seemed terrifying, but in fact were both necessary and potentially constructive. Lightning strikes, 18th century science told us, could refresh the air and of toxins. Volcanic eruptions could make soil more fertile. Apologists for the revolution used these scientific notions to reassure their public, and possibly themselves, that good would come out of these moments of apparent disruption. One of the most chilling of this, a quotation from Louis-Marie Proudhon in November of 1793, was reporting in his Révolution de Paris on the public spirit in Paris after terror had or had not been placed on the national agenda, depending on who you choose to trust. Proudhon explained, "It is thus that hell, which purifies the atmosphere, destroys the good grain as well as the sterile hay. But these mistakes are inevitable, and for the revolution to be complete, it is better for it to sweep away more rather than less in its whirlpool." So if hailstorms were necessary to restore the purity of the atmosphere, then the analogous terror, and even its execution of a few good grains, was required to build a new and purified republic. By linking nature and revolution, I contend, revolutionaries were able to harness the same kind of faith in the powers of nature that Lacépède himself had exhibited, and then link that faith with revolution. If the processes of nature were inevitable and destructive, if the revolution itself was like nature, if the Frenchmen were, as Berlin would say in 1794, revolutionary like nature, then the revolution itself was only unstoppable, but was also necessary, just, and benevolent, if we could only step back and sort of take a long view and a perspective on things. The second finding I had, and perhaps the more important one, particularly given the recent work of Jan Edelstein, natural republicanism, we find that natural language and metaphors seem to replace the idea of the general will and descriptions of the revolutionary government at the height of the terror. As Jacques-Nicolas Biot-Varenne would explain on the 14th of Frimaire, year 2, the best civil constitution is one that is nearest to the processes of nature. By this, he meant a constitution that was centralized, one with a single center of power and efficient levers, in his words, that would transmit the will of the government to the periphery. He was actually justifying the diminishing role of the people as a motivating force in revolutionary government. But he did so by replacing political theory with a kind of rudimentary physics, using nature to justify the choice. Surely this gives new meaning to the idea of political science. So for me, looking to the annals of nature, or at least to the ways the revolutionary writers looked to the annals of nature, helped me first understand how revolutionaries may have understood and justified the violence of the revolution, And second, has made me reconsider the politics of the terror as a moment in which faith and emotion replaced reason and nature replaced human agency in political rhetoric. And yet, there is, of course, no way to fix a single meaning of nature in any period. Nature is at once the crops growing in the field and the hailstorm that destroys them. It is both the cultivated garden and the overgrown forest. So my research was necessarily extremely limited, and its choice of specific images and metaphors seemed to pop up frequently in the rhetoric of the revolution. And in fact, a big part of my own research is less about nature and much more about language, about the way that language changes in moments of crisis, and the way that it offers opportunities to limit or to shape human behavior. My favorite passage, Thucydides, he gives a description of life in the midst of civil war in Corcyra, and he says, to fit in with the change in events, words too had to change their meanings. And it should surprise none of us that we see this very phenomenon in the French Revolution. In this time of tumult, of sometimes sublime transformation, old words failed, and new ones, and this vacuum was filled with both new words and new meanings. This was, as studied in connotation, the natural world. A mountain could suddenly signify an ardent revolutionary, a volcano could also creative energy. But as we all know from the past 25 years in particular of work on political culture of the revolution, this applied also to other symbols of the revolutionary moment. What people wore, what classical figures they invoked in their speeches, what their gardens, what language they used to address their fellow citizens. All of these quotidian choices, new and powerful meanings with sometimes fatal implications in this period. So there's no doubt that, and in addition, there's absolutely no doubt that the only way that people are talking about the violence of the revolution. So maybe this leads us to the question that underpins this very panel, which is, why should we use nature as a prism through which to understand the revolution? Why should we turn to nature or to science as one of the key ways of understanding this period? All of these other classical feminism, what you're gardening with, things that you're wearing, right? There are all of these other ideas and intellectual concepts that we could turn to instead. Is there even any difference between studying the language of nature versus, say, Greco-Roman allusions, invocations of social contract theory, and so on? And perhaps the most fitting question for this is, in what ways does my work on the discourse of nature fit in with studies of real nature, the environmental histories and historians of science that have showed up and that have done really extraordinary work in our field in the last 15 years? So I hope to have an answer to this question, and I hope in some ways that this will relate to Ken's comments about how we might link disciplinary studies with the world of things and with real nature that people are interested in. I think on the one hand, these things are worth studying because they're there, right? I mean, I think it is actually worth noting that revolutionaries are using images like volcanoes to talk about the work that they're undertaking. But I don't think that that's all. I think that there's something really different about studying the discourse of nature rather than any other constellation of ideas and images generated in the revolutionary moment. And most importantly, it is because nature was something with which individuals had real, lived experiences that could have either challenged or confirmed these often elite representations of the revolution. In this way, it differs from classical imagery. And Robert Blackman gave a great talk yesterday on some of the problems that one might have when you make allusion to a classical reference. He gave the example of a reference that was made to Cicero and the ways in which it was misheard and misinterpreted in a variety of different settings. And I think that gives us a really good example that on the one hand, metaphors are always, when people choose allusions or metaphors, they're always running the risk that they will have stood. But there's a huge difference between someone making a reference to Cicero and someone making a reference to lightning. On the one hand, everyone in the room knows what lightning is when you say it, right? Not everyone in the room, and I think Robert showed us this yesterday. Not everyone in the room is necessarily going to know who Cicero is or what specific anecdote from Plutarch's Lives you're making reference to, right? So on the one hand, lightning is very useful in that way. But on the other hand, there's a different set of preconceptions that are associated with Cicero than there are with lightning. So people that might have read about would have notions about who Cicero is, but no one in the room could say, you know what, I've met Cicero, I really think he's representing him here, right? It's a completely different story with nature, where everyone actually would have had interactions with these very types of metaphors that the people are drawing on. So, for example, Jean-Marie Roland described the September massacres as, quote, equal to the action of a torrent that overturns obstacles, but whose flooding will bring ravages and devastation if it does not quickly return to its riverbed. And he made this allusion on the very day that the national legislature was debating whether or not to fund the construction of seawalls and canals in parts of France. So as the legislature is discussing, we should be controlling nature, we should be doing it, we should be funding it, he's using this as the image to talk about what's been going on in the streets of Paris. Where he made this blithe comparison, one that was picked up by several Jacobin apologists for the massacres, a mere 2 years after real flooding had devastated much of the land along the Loire River. So when citizens of Montbrison, who had written in a 1790 petition to the government that the waters of the flooded Loire had overturned entire buildings, killed 10 people in their village, and annihilated several of their farm animals, when those citizens read about the flood of the September massacres, they perhaps had a different interpretation than the one the Jacobins sought to conjure when they described the inevitable overflows of the people's justice. The natural world, unlike many of the other images and symbols drawn upon by revolutionaries, was not merely symbolic or imagined. It was lived and experienced as a source of livelihood and loss, as a site for experimentation and admiration. In this way, invocations of nature in festivals or speeches may have been particularly legible and relevant to a broader public in ways that references to Cicero may not have been, but they also may have rung hollow as a result of lived experience or jangled in dissonance with individuals' real life with the natural world. It is in these spaces where rhetoric met reality, where my work, those of our environmental historians and of science, that I think there is a real opportunity to see both the limits and possibilities of revolutionary discourse as it was received, interpreted, and created on a local level. After all, the image of a mountain would mean one thing to Parisian audiences and something together to a citizen who lived in the shadow of or worked on the slopes of Mont Blanc. In fact, the easy-to-climb mountain that was the centerpiece of the Festival of Supreme Being would have borne little resemblance to the mountains that Savoyards would know so well. I'm sure several of you guys are familiar with the image of the mountain that's erected at the center of this festival, but it's simply made in this sort of pastoral, really kind of peaceful image. It's made so that the members of the convention can sort of climb on it. Women are up there singing about it, right? And I wonder when I see these representations, and there were engravings of these that were made and distributed, and I wonder if these show up in Mont Blanc, if people sort of look at this and are like, that's not my mountain, right? I mean, if it's actually sort of an alienating experience in a sense, right? I'd actually be really interested to know if mountain iconography changed in these different places. So if actually a Mont Blanc mountain representing Jacobin Mountain would look different than the one that they did in Paris. Likewise, the constructive power of destructive nature might have been a much harder sell in, say, Saint-Domingue, where earthquakes weren't something that people read about in natural history books or admired in dramatic paintings, but particularly for survivors of the 1770 Port-au-Prince quake, were events that they had experienced and that adamantly had not been either benevolent or restorative. In my book, I discuss policy debates, draining swampland throughout France, and the ways in which those debates inflected Jacobin discourse about the evils of the political marché. So in this discourse, both real and rhetorical swamps were corrupted, they were impure, they were dangerous to people around them. But on the other hand, there are plenty of communities throughout France that adamantly did not want the swamps and the ponds in their territory to be drained. Would they have reacted with the kind of proud opposition to songs that proclaimed the dangers of the marée and the noxious air that they emitted? Might this have even made them sympathize with the political marée in ways that we would never have imagined? We also see, when we examine nature at the local level, moments in which nature was clearly not working on behalf of devoted revolutionaries. In years 2 and 3, hailstorms, those very things that Proudhon had claimed were essential for purifying the atmosphere, had devastated farmland in Creuse and in Cher. An indemnity request into the government in the year 3, the commune of Vierzon announced that they were on the threshold of famine due to these storms. These moments when indemnities were called for, when floods occurred, when hailstorms destroyed crops, would also have been the moments in which revolutionary rhetoric of nature's order and nature's work on the behalf of the revolution of the French nation would most clearly have fallen flat. In these instances, legislators and reporters' invocations of the benevolence of nature, let alone of the goodness of specific devastating acts like floods and hailstorms, must have struck listeners as naive at best and callous at worst. The clash between the rhetoric of benevolent nature and the reality of destructive nature may provide real opportunities for us to examine resistance to revolutionary explanations and justifications of their actions. In addition, we see in these moments of confrontation over the natural world various ideas of controllability, agency, and sovereignty laid bare. Even if the rhetoric of nature was national, and by this I mean that I couldn't discern local differences in the way that individuals were invoking images, the reality of individuals' interactions with nature were decidedly local. Histories of the revolutionary period demonstrate the extraordinary local differences in the ways that men and women interacted with the natural world, and the ways in which legislation mediated those interactions. The policies the French government pursued toward the relationship between citizens and their surroundings could have enormous consequences both for the environment and for the trust that citizens had in their representatives. Noelle Plack, in her 2009 book, Common Land, Wine, and the French Revolution, gives the example of the aftermath of a law of 1792 that required that common lands be divided after the next harvest, and that stated the rules regulating the mode of dividing land would be forthcoming. And yet they were not, in fact, forthcoming. So while the while the peasants were essentially awaiting further instruction, communes, the land remained uncultivated. And so communes ran the risk of not producing enough food for their inhabitants because of this legislative silence. In this case, legislators' words and promises could threaten the very livelihood of French citizens. Of course, these moments where people were requesting indemnities also reveal that legislators were sometimes asked to intervene when citizens losses as a result of natural disasters. In the Département of the Loire, flooding of the Loire caused 300,000 livres damage in November of 1790. And the National Assembly responded by giving the inhabitants 1/10 of that sum to repair the damages and rebuild their levees, after which the engineer and repairs made an unfavorable comparison with the Ancien Regime. When the Loire flooded in early 1789, he wrote, "The king provided over 5 times the number you guys gave us in recompense. So the new governmental assistance here suffered in comparison." Likewise, petitioners compared the suffering in the inundation of the Rhone with a similar event in 1755, noting that the government, quote, gave more than 200,000 livres to this community in that event. The letter continued in what could only be described as a wheedling tone. "If, under the reign of ministerial despotism, there was concern for our sorrows, we dare to hope that the august representatives of the nation will vote on our behalf for relief that is both just and necessary." These petitions give us an extraordinary glimpse into the ways in which local officials thought that the role of the national government should operate. The National Assembly and the National Convention were expected, like the king, to provide for the people of France at moments when they were harmed by uncontrollable nature. We see here a citizenry that called on the government to intervene in moments when nature worked against them, when they lost crops or property or farm animals as a result of flooding, hailstorms, and disease. But these petitions also show us the possibility that citizens might lose confidence in revolutionary government as these very measures, as individuals use these moments to make the new system against the old. Policies governing the relationship between man and nature had cause not just for the communities that risk famine, as in the example in Noelle Plack's book, also for the legislator representatives on mission who risk losing the support of the public. The real world provided an opportunity for petitioners to rhetorically contest the efficacy of the revolutionary government. It is in these spaces, in requests for payment after uncontrollable nature devastated citizens' property, in contestation over government policies regulating land use, in resistance to representations that did not coincide with citizens' experience of the natural world, that we as historians have the opportunity to see the ways in which revolutionary rhetoric and reality collided. Revolutionaries had turned to nature as a way of giving stability to what was unstable, to provide a sense of order to what seemed disorder. But to use a natural metaphor of my own, in doing so they unwittingly stood on shifting stands. To rethink Thucydides, nature too could change its meanings. The very thing that made nature a useful source of metaphor, that is, its universal legibility, also meant that it could be interpreted locally, individually, and in ways that were utterly unanticipated and unintended by the revolutionaries themselves. And for us to understand the issue of that collision between reality and rhetoric, I think we need to do the very kind of work that Ken Alder has asked us for today, namely think about how we might better investigate this relationship between words and things. And I hope that part of our conversation after this will be about how we might institutionally help make these kinds of connections possible, but also how we as researchers might inventively imagine ways of comparing the reality with the rhetoric as we address these words, these remnants that we're actually left with. So thanks very much.
If I could ask the panelists to come down, and we'll move the chairs in front here so we can have a conversation. We've got plenty of time.
Are we all in field of view? Wide angle.
So this was an incredibly rich panel, wonderful 3 papers, and I would just like to open the floor now to you. Yeah, Dave.
Julia, thanks for bringing back the literature of the revolution. And so I have 2 questions. One more methodological and one about the literature itself. I'll start with the literature one. So, I'm not sure how to phrase this. You started off by saying, we're taught that this isn't literature, it's worth reading. It's not, nothing really of importance happened. I mean, hearing your summary of the Nogari novel, which I haven't read, I mean, I have to say it doesn't really sound like the kind of, canon-shattering work that is going to make its way onto every 18th century reading list. And so I just wanted to ask you, do you think that this is literature that will be read on its own grounds, or that is only really of interest for longer literature and you're connecting it with much better known text? So are we only going to read it because there's a connection to Mary Shelley? And also, can it not actually pointed to the real problems of this literature ever making it into a canon, precisely because of the intensive need of connecting it with the very immediate control events of the moment? I mean, isn't that almost an insurmountable obstacle to making this literature more broadly accessible? So that's the literary question. The methodological question, I have to say, I'm really scratching my head as to why you call this positive. Because it sounds kind of like historicism, that you're making a strong pitch for contextualization, for recognizing that you can't separate these particular texts from their moment. But positivism is a much stronger claim. It's this idea that a text has one meaning, that it's you think that only meaning it's true. You're not really allowing for multiple interpretations in a positivist. And there's sort of this assumption that there's a scientific method that will get you to that meaning, and that you're not going to accept, or that you're going to demonstrate that that's correct. I mean, is that really the kind of strong claim you want to make, or are you using new positivism just as another way of talking about some kind of historicism?
So my short answer would be, I cannot forget now. Is it either no or yes or yes? All right, so the first question about the literary merits of these works. I think this audience would teaching the French Revolution important, right? Well, teaching literature is really good to teach the French Revolution. It's more fun than reading a whole bunch of speeches or a whole bunch of newspaper articles. In one short story of 75 pages, you can get a lot across. And I didn't find one chef-d'oeuvre inconnu in all this research I did. The book is based on about 300. I went through the Milton and Frauci bibliography and Carla Hess's bibliography and the Montcalm bibliography, and looked for titles that had anything to do with politics. I was interested in political history as it's on literature. So that's what I looked for. I wasn't looking for anything like that. And came up with a representative sampling of books that I think are interesting. None of them are chef-d'oeuvre. but I have taught them. I've even taught the Signature La Madeleine, all 800 pages of it. I might not do that again, but it was a very experience, and out of it, 3 people totally inspired to work. They are currently PhD students at NYU, Columbia, and Brown, and they will be integrating some of that material and the excitement of this new archive into their work. And I think if we can get students excited, good. You know, in my period, I was in graduate school in the 80s. It was all, I wasn't unfortunately in a history department. I was in a literature department. It was all about women's studies. It was all about women's literature. Okay, well now, here we are 30 years later. Is that stuff really worth reading? Some of it yes, some of it no. But it was very exciting, and it got people excited about the 18th century. And I'm excited about the 18th century and the Revolutionary period and the 19th century, and showing students how to get from one to the other. So yes, I really do use these materials in teaching. And I think that our primary goal is really, I don't know about you, but I'm a teacher. I write to scholars and I teach to students. And this research for me has been terribly exciting and rejuvenating for the literature classroom. Exactly. I am a literature teacher. I teach a very historical kind of literature class. But now that I can put in, I've got a repertoire of little stories. Mostly I choose shorter books that I put in between Laclos and Bonnet. And it really makes the class a much more interesting class. The students are much more excited about, and they want to know about history. They want to know about the revolution. So, you know, a lot of it, I think your attitude toward the canon is very strange to me, because a lot of the books that, you know, what about, I teach Le Rouge et Le Noir. Well, did you know how many copies that sold when it first came out? About 7. That was not a canon busting book at the time. And it's got a lot of flaws in it today, too.
But it's interesting that you say, you know, it's important to teach the French Revolution. This is a good way to teach the French Revolution.
Yes, it is.
And I think that's a great, innovative way to teach the French Revolution. I'm just wondering if you're teaching a class that's on, say, the novel, right?
Yeah, I am. No, I'm not teaching the French Revolution. I'm teaching classes on literary history that go from the Enlightenment to the 19th.
I see.
And I pick something from this field in between.
Some very difficult obstacles for students who might not know anything about the history of the French Revolution, which is in itself.
Well, that's why you pick 1 or 2.
Well, but I mean, because you're also telling us, you know, just how complicated it is to read these novels and how much contextual information you need to make sense of them.
Right.
I mean, you can read them.
But I'm talking.
Without really knowing
Your question about literature, is, in my opinion, has to do with teaching. I mean, canons are made for teaching. Canons are made for transmitting knowledge. Scholarship is different than teaching, very different. And my hardline positivism, and yes, I do assume the word positive. I don't think New Historicism took literary studies far enough, deep down into facts. I am not happy with a lot of literary scholarship that I see. I find it totally useless, frankly, because people just want to interpret without really understanding what they're talking about. And like I said, about the French Revolution, that's all I'm talking about. Many fine, you know, works of literary analysis are done, but not of this field. Because, and when I see this, is my husband did sinology in graduate school, Chinese studies, medieval Chinese, and we used to talk, and he would say they had to do the most very kind of scholarship. Just figure, who is this author? When was this written? You know, what does this word mean? And that is what I'm talking about, yes. It's very old-fashioned, because I do think that there's just a lot of there's just not known. So if we're going to try to do this kind of excavating of these unknown texts, yes, we do have to do that kind of scholarship. It's the very first thing to do.
So
later on we can
philology then.
Yeah, okay. And then later we can analyze them in interesting ways if we want to. But I don't think that there's only one positivism either. I mean, there's other positivisms than what you described. You know, okay, it became philology later. Yeah, but let's not dominate this conversation here.
Yeah, let's have another question.
Si je peux en français.
Ouais, vas-y.
Et dans ce que vous avez montré finalement dans vos 3 communications, il me semble, c'est qu'après avoir se beaucoup intéressé aux juristes, par exemple, des gens qui créaient, construisaient des normes, on voit bien que les hommes de lettres et les savants ont joué dès 1789 un rôle très important dans la construction de nouvelles normes, au moins de la manière dont on voyait la société. Et justement, après des approches, on parlait de politisation des sciences, d'engagement des hommes de lettres et des savants. Il me semble qu'aujourd'hui, on repose, et je pense que comme vous l'avez bien montré, on repose de nouvelles questions un petit peu aux dynamiques politiques. C'est là-dessus que je voulais juste, parce que j'ai bien apprécié le discours sur la nature. Il y a, en termes que vous avez compris, c'est la contre-révolution. Parce que naturellement, tous les problèmes autour de l'usage de ce qu'on appelle la nature. Je me souviens d'un épisode en 1793, lorsqu'on ouvre le muséum d'histoire naturelle au public, les citoyens se précipitent sur les fleurs qui viennent de planter les Salons. Naturellement, là, on a un choc entre deux cultures, la culture de Bernard de Saint-Pierre et la culture du peuple. Il y a un autre choc, les pionnières, très rapidement, vont s'approprier ce terme de nature. Et on voit bien que l'Empire, finalement, parce qu'il y a aussi une manière d'écrire l'histoire, l'histoire civile, l'histoire naturelle. Je voulais savoir si vous preniez ça en opération dans votre étude sur, parce que vous travaillez sur le terme de nature, bien naturellement la nécessité, peut-être qu'on retrouve là la nécessité de réintroduire le contexte, mais la nécessité de bien voir qui parle et à quel moment, parce que naturellement là il y a différents usages du terme.
Can I answer in English?
Yeah.
Okay. You pointed to one of the great slipperinesses of this kind of work, right, which is that nature is not the property of the revolutionaries any more than it is the counter-revolutionaries. And one of my chapters in the book is the volcano, and there's hundreds of counter-revolutionaries that are calling revolution a volcano destroying everything. What's interesting to me is that then there are Jacobins that are saying, heck yes, we're a volcano, but we're a volcano that's targeting specific individuals, or we're a volcano that's making the land more fertile, we're a volcano that's purifying the innards of the earth. So they're both using the same image, but they're using it to really, really different purposes. I think the book is necessarily narrow in this regard, and I mean the book actually starts not being about nature at all. I was actually interested in how revolutionaries were talking about their own violence and saw this as a continuing trope, and that's how it sort of developed from there. So it meant that the rhetoric of counter-revolutionaries was not playing a significant role. But I do think, and that's actually why I think, this turn I take today is important to me, because I think that both groups are using this with the kind of face they're legible. But in both cases, the ways that in many cases elites, right, are using these images can be co-opted and manipulated and totally misunderstood. So even as the images are used on both sides, they're being interpreted in really different ways on the ground in a certain sense. So thanks for your question.
Please. Well, and this is on the subject of, of universal legibility. But I'm just thinking, what's the Peg when he's writing? So he's sitting at this moment when there's this debate, how do we explain the geology of the earth? Well, maybe it's volcanoes, but maybe it's floods. And there are all sorts of things going into this, the age of the earth, its compatibility with biblical literalism. And so, they're thinking about what volcanoes mean. And nobody wants to go back to sort of an old school intellectual history where, just explain these ideas. But on the other hand, how do we get at this idea that, a volcano is more than just what you see when you look at a volcano, nature is more than just what you see when you go outside. I'll leave it at that. You're pushing against universal legibility, but how do we sort of get at what people mean when they say volcano?
Yeah, this was the great project of the book, actually. And it's hard to know. Sometimes they tell you, and that's when it's most useful, right? We are like a volcano building new earth, right? And then you're like, yeah, that's going in there. And honestly, we have instances that I can't actually make use of because they just say, we're, this is a. Actually, the flood is a really good example. Sometimes it's actually quite unclear, especially in the wake of the September massacres, where this flood imagery pops up everywhere. Salon is using the flood to say, we need to build barriers, we need to control the people. Some of the Jacobins are saying, this was a flood, it was inevitable, things are going to grow back. They don't care that much about controlling the flooding waters. So a lot of it is looking for sort of linguistic clues. I spent a lot of time looking at scientific discourse and what parts of scientific discourse people might have been picking up on. I had a couple of instances. We have Robespierre who writes about lightning rods, and so you can sort of maybe pull out a little bit of that when he's talking about lightning. Marat who writes on volcanoes, and there's a couple of instances where we actually can see some of the scientific background of these revolutionary writers and thinkers. So you can in a certain sense. But I mean, there's plenty of cases, and I'll point back again to Robert's paper yesterday. I mean, there's plenty of cases where the meaning of a metaphor is totally illegible to us as historians, and says it was equally illegible to the people who were reading it or listening to it at the time.
I don't know if it's that it's illegible, but it's incredibly motile. Yeah. And despite the presumption to nature for something extra-human and beyond, in some sense, politics, it turns out that certainly the metaphors about nature are very plastic, very adaptable by anyone. There is another. I mean, it's not that language is unimportant. I'm not saying that at all. But one thing to look for places like, for the lightning rod case, like Jessica Riskin did into a court case, and you look at how people tried to marshal these lines. It's all still rhetorics. That's what the law is as well. But you're trying to solve, at least in some social context, some social problem, and you look at the practices, what kinds of arguments people marshal and what kinds of results it had, and that can be helpful. So for the example of the volcano, there's at this moment a history of the Earth question. Previous revolutions, right? The Earth is suddenly being discovered to have existed in phases. Suddenly you have a new way of thinking about the age of the Earth. It's still metaphorical, but the revolution's forced to confront the fact that, well, if we're going to use that metaphor of the revolution and us in revolution, there's a history there. So how do you suddenly start to change the history of how do people start to write the history of the revolution at the time as having itself layered?
I could give you a very precise example from Poela ou l'Enfant du Mystère, du Milieu. He wrote abundant footnotes on alpine flora and fauna, including the whistling marmot, in some of these novels. And I'm not quite sure why, but there's a lot of footnotes about flora and fauna in genre of sentimental fiction of the late 1790s. And it's very localized. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I had a short question from Oh, yes, you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. So I don't know if it will be appropriate. It's a question for Ken, because sometimes we almost lost the connection. So, well, I will try. I was very interested about what you said about popular science and popular sciences. But what do you think about that? What do you think about class scientists and non-academic scientists of the Enlightenment, as Jean-Paul Marat, for example? What role did they play in the French Revolution? Did they only use science as a metaphor, political metaphor, for propaganda to build new citizens? Or did they influence new policies, for example, during the French Revolution? What do you think?
New practices? Is that what you said at the end?
New policies.
New policies.
Sorry.
I think the answer is absolutely yes. And so you pick Marat, who is obviously a famous troublemaker in all sorts of ways before the revolution, and you could take a Darton-esque kind of line on these sorts of. But actually, of course, if by popular science you mean not the great savant, but the many thousands of ordinary people that worked at the level of apothecaries in chemistry, or people who were lower than the great sort of engineer savant like Vaucanson, but who had to build bridges and design, they're tremendously important. I mean, in some ways, you could argue that we focus far too much on, the Cuviers and far less people that do digging and finding. And it's in the practices, for example, of botanizing the world and bringing back specimens and involve local people and famously discovering the connection between meteors and meteorites. So that world of popular science shouldn't be equated with pseudoscience at all. After all, even the grand savants are not scientists in many senses of the term, and science has incredibly broad reach in provincial societies of knowledge making. So I think the history of science is absolutely, in this period, a way to get away from the study of narrow bands of people or elites. Not that those are unimportant.
Okay.
But I mean, to equate popular science with somehow pseudo-science would be a tremendous mistake. Whatever pseudoscience means, a very contested category in and of itself.
Okay, any other? Yeah, let's take one more question and then we'll take a little break and go on to the next section.
It seems to me one of the practices that we historians of science can help with in this regard is precisely not so much equating popular sciences with non-elite science with pseudoscience, but the historicity of the boundary work that goes into producing those categories.
Right.
So that's something we ought to be good at, we don't always do. And that's changing in ways across period. And the revolution is huge for this, the emergence of all the periodicals. So changing the way science is being circulated and understood in terms of who's contributing and who isn't, and that continues to change. So that's one of the exact places where practice courses we can go with other ways of thinking. And I think this kind of work could be done well.
Absolutely.
Okay, I think we will stop here, take a break, and back for the second session from Paris, and we can continue the discussion. It starts, I would imagine, does it start at 10 o'clock? I don't have my program. I think it should start at 10. Yeah. So we have a 10-minute break, and then invite you all back. Thank you. So